please give a Stony Words welcome to Danny Dorling.
Thanks for coming. I can see the clock, which means I will only speak for about 30 minutes, which gives us lots of time for questions and answers. Because probably quite a lot of what I say might annoy some of you, because we're talking about the biggest things that people worry about. And if the things I say are worrying are not the ones that you think are most worrying, you might get riled. This is all about people's concerns. What does a geographer do? We do all kinds of different things. I'm a human geographer, so I look at where people are, what their chances are in life, how that alters, what impacts that. But geographers are actually quite good at looking at crises. Geography began, well, it's a very old discipline, but it began in this country again in 1899 in my university, which is the University of Oxford, where they established a department to train geographers. And you might think, why did they want a department in 1899 to train geographers? That's because we had something for people to do, which was to run an empire. And we needed to train colonial officers, and they needed to know about people and cities and rivers and floods and earthquakes, and also not being very nice, having a stiff upper lip and so on. And that's the background of our discipline. We don't often say that is what our discipline came from in England, because not particularly proud about it. Geography then shrank and became less important until, thankfully for us, bad for the planet, we were measuring glaciers and noticed that they weren't coming down anymore, they were going backwards. And it took a bit of time to work out why the glaciers were going backwards, but climate change is in the remit of geography. So that's a very short introduction to why am I standing in front of you looking at this. The other reason why I'm talking about this and looking at the next crisis is I became sick of writing books about inequality in Britain. The last one I wrote was called Shattered Nation, and I thought at the time, if I carry on doing this, somebody like Robert Jenrick is going to pick this up and use it for his speech, and that's exactly what we're seeing now. So you have people on the left of politics, it's fairly obvious to you, it will be soon, that's where I am, writing about how bad things are getting, and then people on the right of politics picking up that writing and saying, we can sort it all out if you just elect us and have something completely different. That gets quite depressing. So you might think, why is he looking at the next crisis? Because when you look at things worldwide, or even within Europe, you often don't find the situation to be as bad as it is in this country. The UK is the most unequal country in Europe by income. We're not the place that has the success stories. You can go outside the UK and see the success stories of societies where the gap between people are less. We have one of the worst life expectancies in Western Europe. There are only about 6 countries in all of Europe where babies are more likely to die in the first 4 weeks of life. Like lots of depressing stuff in this country. So I thought, get out of that and look a bit more worldwide. The publisher picked the title, and the publisher picked the images for the book because they want to sell the book. That's why it's looking, shining at you, looking so yellow and staring at you. And the book contains some graphs. Don't worry if you can't see these or read these. These are mainly a prop for me so that I keep to the subject and so that you have an idea that I'm not just making up what I'm going to tell you about. Crises are interesting. In the last couple of years, people have talked about how we've been in a polycrisis, crisis after crisis. If I had more time, I'd do a poll and try and get you to agree on the date when you remember that there wasn't a crisis. How many people look back at the 60s and think that was nice, and the 70s were actually my best decade, or the 80s were worse? This graph here, quite hard to see, is the mention of the word crisis in English language publications. Starts in 1800, really, really low. There were no crises in the 1810s, 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, 1850s. It's all fine. Crisis only began in the 1960s. Now, obviously, there were many, many wars. Most of these publications were being published in Europe. Enormous number of epidemics. They've become less frequent over time. Fewer people die in pandemics now than have ever died. They come very rarely. It's not been that long since we've just had one, but we don't get typhoid and cholera and measles and one after another anymore. But we do start worrying about crises. 1960s, Cuban Missile Crisis. But then if you look at the graph, more mention of crises in the 70s, more in the 80s, more in the 90s. The graph ends in 2019, which is brilliant, because I absolutely know that when the data is updated, 2020, unbelievable crisis. How can the world carry on? So the good news is, it's not that we're suddenly living in an era of more crises. For some reason, we have been worrying more about things since the 1960s. And then we get away from data into speculation. If you want my speculation on this, I think this is a relatively placid time in the world. Actually, time to worry about things because you're not in another world war. We're all sitting here, and we've got to an age that most of our grandparents and great-grandparents never got to. Right? We don't count our blessings, we don't see successes. So I think that is part of it. Mass increase in education, mass increase in reading, mass increase in worrying. But of course, we also haven't sorted things out. The way we run the world isn't good. This is a graph of some people who say that there are no crises, everything is getting better. This is a standard graph from economics about the number of people who are poor in the world. The number of people who are poor, this is a kind of $2 a day, 1.97, I think. It's going down, this goes up to 8 billion, all the greener people who are not poor, isn't everything getting better? I don't believe that. I'm just putting it forward to let you know there are people who say everything's getting better, don't they realise it's getting better? I only have 15 slides, so don't worry. There are lots of sources of data you can go to see or find ways of saying what the biggest crises are. My favourite's going to come out, or may just have come out, from Davos. The chief risk managers of the world every year produce a report in Davos where they tell us what the most likely really bad thing is going to be this year. And if you look back, it doesn't normally happen. But their job is to worry about crises. There are people paid to do that. What I've used for the book is a very large series of Ipsos-Mori polls which have been taking place in over 30 countries, which include India for a couple of decades. The Chinese Academy of Social Science does a very similar one every 2 or 3 years in China. And so I've looked at what do you find when people are asked what they most worry about in their country. Now, the wording of all these surveys are incredibly important. It uses the word worry, obviously translated, and it's about your country, not necessarily you. This, I think, is 2002 to 2024, so it was the most recent at the time I was just finishing the book. I was just finishing the book at the point when Donald Trump was elected. Which was kind of interesting thing. But the surveys are from just before then. It doesn't matter too much because actually the aggregate of people's concerns over 30 countries only changes very slowly. In an individual country, you can suddenly get a new event shoots up. People in Poland are suddenly worried about war in 2022. They weren't in 2021. But averaged over 30 countries, those individual events don't worry people so much. So, the biggest concern, most countries of the world, most of the time for most people, in fact there are two, and they're the same, is inequality and poverty, and the cost of living. And each of those two individually is the biggest concern. So if you put the cost of living and inequality and poverty together, it absolutely is the number one concern of the majority of people in richer countries of the world who fill in surveys like this. Hasn't always been that case. It's interesting to see how it's increased over time. And that's partly lobbying. It is a result of people saying this really matters. It is, of course, the result of a cost of living crisis beginning in the pandemic, of inflation, because it's harder to move things around and you can increase how much you charge for them. But it was number one before that occurred. Most people filling in these surveys are not very badly off. Surveys tend to be filled in by the middle class. But the proportion of the middle class, if you like what we used to call the upper class, we don't call now that everything's middle class. The proportion of the middle class who are so well off, they don't have to worry about the cost of things, is tiny. So our biggest concern in the world is how to get by. How are we going to be able to afford to get by? The second one used to be the biggest, about 10, 15 years ago. And this shocked me because I hadn't expected it at all. And it's unemployment. It's the fear of unemployment. And I suddenly realised my own position. I haven't worried about unemployment for a long time. It's quite hard to sack me. And I'm getting nearer and nearer to a retirement age, right? Where you worry less about this. But I looked at it and I thought, this is really odd, because it's also a very big worry in the UK. How can unemployment be such a big worry when we have such a low unemployment rate? And the answer is that people are really scared of losing their jobs. Some do, but many who don't lose their jobs are very scared of losing their jobs. Many young people, young adults, are scared about not getting one. The university students that I teach, even the university students that I teach, who are fairly privileged at my university, are quite worried that nobody's really going to want them to do something. Their levels of anxiety and mental ill health have risen over time. We measure these things, I'm interested in measuring. So unemployment is number two, the fear that you're not going to be needed. Now what I do in the book is I couple that with things like the fear of immigration, which is much lower, it's down here in the combined surveys, but you have to put these things together if you're going to write chapters and have some kind of structure. So I link the fear of immigration to the fear of unemployment. It's not that immigration, by the way, is going to make you unemployed. If people come, they create jobs. More jobs than the job that they do. 4, crime violence, mostly local crime and violence, burglary, robbery, being beaten up, is there as a fear, but I've also included war and terrorism in there, which is a lower fear apart from people in those countries that are at war or that are neighbouring countries that are at war. But it's still there. It affects your home. Things won't carry on. That's a perennial fear. Chapter 5, the next biggest fear, cradle to the grave issues. Is the health service going to work? Are the schools not working? Is the government not working? Is there corruption? And putting all those together, how is the state working? In China, this is the biggest fear. Because in China, despite China having the income inequality of the USA, which is worse than us, China's very unequal, but almost everybody's seen the living standards rise. In China, inequality and poverty and cost of living isn't a big fear. Unemployment isn't a big fear because the government makes sure people have jobs. Crime and violence isn't a fear because there's hardly any crime and violence, and China tends not to go to war. Tries not to. So why cradle to the grave services, and in particular health service? Partly because you've always got to have a worry. If you ask people, what's the things that worry you most, you've got to be quite robust to go with none of them. But I suspect that navigating your way through the care system, the health system in China, may require some bribes, just my suspicion. There's a bit of talking to some people. But also, this is an elderly population with fewer and fewer younger people. And the bigger concern you have, the biggest main concern people have in their lives is their health. And if you're worried about your health and you're worried about whether it can be looked after, and you're looking at a health system that is changing rapidly and gearing up, but where some people get treated and others don't, you could see it could be a big fear. And then finally, on the international rankings, by having lumped lots of other things together to create these big categories, I get climate number 6. So, people worry about other things, middle class people worry about things other than the climate crisis, more than the climate crisis. We are the country that worries most about climate in the world, but even us, it is lower and dropping. Just fatigue, been going on about it too long, it's still a faraway event. It ranks highest in the fears of university undergraduates across Europe, interestingly. Right? So I'm interested in how different people care about different things. And then finally, because I work in the School of Geography and the Environment, I put biodiversity. Because, of course, you can argue that the biggest problem is species extinction, because you can't reverse it. All the rest, we might worry about it now, but we're going to be dead. In 100 years' time, these things don't matter. In 200 years' time, the climate crisis doesn't matter, maybe 300. But the biodiversity loss possibly does. Let's skip that because I've been out of time, and skip that. I was going to talk to you about fears of immigration rising and Brexit and so on, but I'm keeping an eye on the clock. It's moving faster. So let's go straight to issues like war and violence. And this was a worry for us, could still be a worry for us. There's conscription increasing again in mainland Europe, in case you didn't know. I was in the Netherlands in December, where a lovely leaflet's gone around called Preparing for War, where the advice is to get some cash out. You shouldn't laugh, it's serious, but you kind of wonder, what are the Dutch government playing at? Scaring people. But war is worrying. So who should most worry about war? There are some very nice Swedish academics who for decades have been very carefully counting up every death in every war and every war-like situation. This is a map of the world with every country made the size of all the people who died in wars from 1989 to I think about 2022. And it's poor countries, it's Muslim countries. It's countries that we decide we're going to bomb, often, not us. Right? That's the reality of the map of war deaths, at least since 1989, which was a year when we're supposed to be coming together. The number of people dying in wars was declining over time until Steven Pinker published Better Angels of Our Nature or whatever. And the minute he published a book saying that violence was ending, suddenly it went up. Don't be too confident in everything you're doing. Lots of worries. And in a sense, you can have a worry that people are not worrying enough about war. Yeah? If you can remember CND being a massive organisation in the past, if you can remember the peace movement after the Second World War, yeah, we used to have a lot of people working very hard to stop wars happening. Now, supposedly, we're going to spend 5% of our GDP on weapons. So you can have these concerns. Cradle to the grave issues. This is about what goes wrong when you don't worry about them. This is how much more likely you are to die in the US, according to your age, than equivalent rich countries. When you're born and when you're a child, you're twice as likely to die if you're in the USA. By the time you get to your 30s, you're 4 times more likely every year. Still unlikely, but 4 times more likely. It's only when you get to age 100 that you're slightly less likely to die, but all the same, which doesn't help, because by the time you get to age 100, I'm afraid you probably are going to die next year. This is John Murdoch. So the book isn't all about graphs, but the graphs won't be contact. John Murdoch for the Financial Times, plotting the life expectancy of Americans and people in England by how much income they've got. And the incredible thing is the two little dots at the top, the best off 1% of people in England and the best off 1% in the USA, they're both dying on average at age 86. All that wealth that these really rich Americans have, and all the access that really rich Americans have to really expensive healthcare, isn't on average helping them one iota. And our 86 for our best off 1% is low from Western European standards. Our life expectancy fell in 2014, 2015, 16, 17 and 18. It rose slightly in 2019. And then of course COVID came. So we're almost back to 2014, but we're not good. So, cradle to grave issues. You can see what goes wrong with schools, with hospitals, with housing if you don't organise them well. There were things that I found more fun to look at. So I've got a section about conspiracy theories in the book. And you've always got to be careful. You've got to be really careful with conspiracy theories. And I apologise to anybody who's theory about how things really work is dismissed. Partly you've got to be careful because they might be true. so YouGov put this poll out 2021, 18th of January 2021, testing a series of conspiracy theories. And one of them was whether the Russians had interfered in the American election. Evidence that it was actually true that they had was released between sending the survey out and getting the answers back. But this is a standard conspiracy theory. Adults who believe a single secretive group rules the world. And the question is, would you say the following statement is true or false? Regardless of who is officially in charge of governments and other organisations, there is a single group of people who secretly control events and rule the world together. Where is it exactly? So obviously it's a question trying to pick up anti-Semitism. You know, that's what it is. But the question's worded so vaguely. You know, we know that people get together in offices and make decisions. Like Tony Blair and George Bush deciding to go to war. You know, it wasn't done with the rest of us involved. So, you know, I have some sympathy for people who say, well, most of the main decisions are made in secret. The key decision in my university, you know, we suddenly discover that we get free ChatGPT because some deals be made with ChatGPT. Nobody asked the lower order staff like me, you know. So decisions are made on this. Anyway, the ranking. The countries that are most likely to think this is the way the world works starts with some of the most unequal. Nigeria, South Africa, Mexico, Turkey. If you think about how decisions are made in Turkey, Greece and Spain. At the bottom, Japan, Denmark, Sweden, interestingly the UK, which is not very equal, Germany, Australia and France. So, if anybody wants to talk about conspiracy theories later, happy to do that. Climate crisis, let's skip that and go to this. Because I've got 5 minutes left. I'm going to keep this. Okay, the climate crisis is absolutely real. Temperatures are rising. It was maybe debatable 25 or 30 years ago how much they were rising. Then we got what was 10 years that became 15 years of just hot summer. So what happens is people move on from, is global warming occurring, to does it really matter? And the problem with the does it really matter, let's give you these numbers, is the number of people who've died and have been affected by climate-related disasters. So these are floods and heat waves, and anything else, so not earthquakes, but floods and heat waves, not volcanoes. In the 1950s, about 77 people died for every million alive in the world from a climate-related disaster. If you think about huge floods in poor areas of the world. In the 60s that dropped to 51, 70s it was 14, still 14 in the 80s, then down to 6 per million, 5, 2, and then in the 2020s it's 1 per million in climate-related disaster. So when you see reporting of floods in Pakistan, and the floods are bigger than they were before, but the counted number of deaths may be 1,200, not tens and tens of thousands. The number of people affected has been dropping for 40 years and gets down to 14 per million per year. It's mobile phones, it's planning, it's roads, it's some awareness, it's governments, but this is adaptation already happening to climate change. So it's hard to get people to worry about climate change now or coming. It's becoming harder to do it, because it's harder to point to evidence that the actual effects on people are worse. The graphs I skipped over show that it is actually the very rich who pollute the most, who create the most carbon and so on. So if you're interested in greater equality, less poverty, less worry, a byproduct is, if you don't let the very rich pollute as much, a byproduct is you'll get less pollution. But trying to tell people to worry about climate change because it's actually making things worse is, I think, tricky at the moment. Point two. Last chapter of the book, the last race, the biodiversity. There are people out there who are really worried about the number of human beings on the planet. Think there are too many. Think we should put contraception in the water to get it down, do mass sterilisation, or that we've already gone over a tipping point and we're going to see this or this is Now the interesting thing is that already our population is slowing down dramatically when it comes to young people. So almost everywhere in the world, without exception, the number of children that people are having is falling. It's falling fastest in the countries where it's highest. There are a few where it's still 5 per woman. That's where it's falling the most quickly. But we in the UK got down to our lowest ever last year, 1.4 children per woman. Really fast drop, by the way. At the same time as we had 400,000 fewer migrants net coming. Fastest drop occurred announced in December last year. But fertility is the key thing. The number of children is dropping everywhere. So these graphs, which are fanciful graphs, produced by people who want to stop there being people because they want to protect species, and some of them care more about birds and worms and mammals and humans. What's interesting to me is that if you look at the fertility changes that are occurring, if they don't slow down, if there isn't a return to an average of 2 children per couple, per potential couple, this is what we're going to get anyway. Now, that isn't in the book. It isn't in the book because it's a more extreme thing to say, but I'm saying it now because it's what I'm working on now. And because all the data that's been released since I did the book is showing that the number of children that people are having has fallen faster in the last year than was thought to be occurring. So we're closing 800 primary schools in London and so on. Partly because it's really expensive to live in London, but partly there are less children. Now this is what I want to end on, just for you to think about. And that rise of the word crisis being used in the 1960s. The highest rate of increases of humans ever in the planet was 1968, when our population rose by 2.1% in just 1 year. Mainly because we were living longer, but a little bit because we are still having more children. We are still having 2.5 to 3 children per couple. As we begin to worry more and more about what's going on in the world, what's going to happen to us, the economy and politics, youngsters everywhere have put off having children, or decided they don't want to have children at all, more often, or just waited another year, or had 1 instead of 2, or 2 instead of 3. Now I can't prove it, but I have a suspicion that the most pernicious effect of all these crises, and us not dealing with them, is an actual rapid decline in the willingness of young people to want to bring another person into the world. I don't think, but that might be me, I don't think it's just that they want to have more fun, more holidays, they can't face the idea of changing nappies, which is what journalists always write. Journalists tend to be quite self-interested people, successful journalists. I have a suspicion that what these concerns are doing is actually making people less sure of themselves and their place in the world. And if that can be shown to be the case, which is really hard, but the longer it carries on, you've got to find a reason. It's not plastics in the water, it's not all the other, and it's happening everywhere. And if you think, breakfast TV began in 1983. If you think back to how little news we used to get before the internet, and now we're bombarded with information. You know, which country's going to be invaded next? A tiny number of narcissists in the world, you get to see their face almost every day. You know, what have they said today in the Oval Office? If you want an idea, there are obviously things we should worry about. Our societies are not going in good directions. If they were going in a good direction, were sustainable, were equitable, were fair, I think people would want to have families of the rate that they're having in the past. But we may also be worrying ourselves sick because we're shown so many things to worry about and we can't put our worries into any kind of order. And we think that other people don't understand how the world works and it's all mad. That's half an hour. Thank you very much for putting up with me.
I don't think putting up with you is the right phrase, actually. But while people think about questions, can I just kind of pose one to you, which is, it's a twofold question actually. It is, okay, in this world then, and the world that you sketched out before us, what is actually the role of politicians, of the politicians we elect? What should they do to help us understand more about what's going on? That's one. And the second half of the question is, and what can or should we do as individuals?
that large business text up there, by the way, is something optimistic about how it's possible to live on the planet.
Yeah.
We're less deferential now, and we expect more of our politicians. We're less deferential, partly because we had this incredible acceleration in education. You know, when I went to school, most children in my school left at age 15 in the main, or 16 at the latest. The idea that you could stay on for 18, so in the past, our politicians were mainly our betters. You doffed your cap at them. They were the clever lad or occasionally lass who went away. And whereas now, we don't look at them and go, oh, they're really able. You know, if anything, so it's not that they weren't great. It's not that they weren't great in the past. We also, for our national politicians, they can only do things at the nation-state level largely, which may not be the level at which these things can be sorted out, because they're international problems that require cooperation, or they're local issues. I think what we need to do is to try to get less maudlin and less despairing. Partly because the Ipsos Mori polls, and they all shows the biggest ever rise in people thinking it's game over. And 7% rise in despair in the last year. So I don't think it helps to get into that situation of thinking it's necessarily as bad as we think it is. It's just that we know more about it now. We know about the 1930s, so we worry about fascism now. Whereas, you know, in the 1930s, they didn't know. They, you know, it came, but they didn't actually know what was possible. And then individually, it's, I think, just largely about doing one thing. be helpful in one way. And be tolerant of others' views, because they really do vary over what matters to people.
Okay, questions? Yeah, Jenny.
In relation to the fertility business, what about the aspect that women are just making the choice themselves that they don't want to have children because they have more interesting things to do or whatever? So it's not actually a despairing thing, or it's actually a positive thing.
Yeah, certainly a lot is positive. It's just as it carries on and on and on. And then we have surveys where we ask people, in particular women, and more women say they would like to have a child than do, or would like to have a second one than do. Where I've only seen one helpful survey, but I'll tell it to you all. Where there's a man and a woman living together, and the man is working from home on the internet, and the woman's commuting into work, that one group in the UK, the women are now more likely to say that they want children than they were before, because the child will be left during the day with them. Really amusingly, the partners have actually become more negative, the man about it. But so a lot of it is about men doing their thing. The problem is that in the most egalitarian countries in the world, a place like Finland, fertility is 1.4, 1.3, 1.2. So certainly the beginning of, you really don't want to have 8, 7, 6, 5 babies. For all. My mum didn't want to have more than 2, which is why 2 of my brothers were adopted. Right? But when you have high numbers of people saying that I actually do want a child rather than none, that's where we may be getting to. There's nothing natural about 2. We didn't realise this. There's no special thing about 2. Right? Natural is higher. Natural is not necessarily good, but natural is more. So there's no reason why we should just have stopped at 2. But the problem is 2 is what you need if you get to steady state. And something like 1.4, if it carries on for long, is an incredible drop very quickly.
John,
Thank you very much. A lot of fascinating things. One of the things I'd like to ask about is, if you go back to one of the early slides, you had, I think, the top 20 things people worry about.
Yeah.
And then on the right, you've selected groups of those subjects.
Yeah.
Now, you're also talking about how we're all subject to overload of news and I would say an overload of information these days, so you can select what you want. You've selected on the right there groupings, some of which are relatively obvious and some of which are perhaps slightly less obvious. Yeah. If I was a right-wing politician, which I'm not, I assure you, I might have chosen immigration, moral decline and unemployment, for instance, and put those 3 together. In fact, you hear right-wing politicians doing that all the time. Yeah. And so, there's a danger in this sort of understanding, in the sense that you can pick what you want from it, can't you? Yeah. And come out with a totally different league table on the right-hand side.
Yeah.
That's a wonderfully gnomic way of saying, are you just as biased as everybody else?
I'm definitely biased. I suspect half my opinions I've made up or recently by the age of 18. But it might be the case for most of us. Yeah. Unless you really rebelled against your parents, who had some conversion, later on in life. I did try to play together. I put immigration really high up there with unemployment early in the book, so I did the right-wing proposition thing. Yeah. But mainly because immigration, in British elections, apart from 2010, immigration was the most salient issue at every election. And political scientists never wanted to say this. We tried to find a way of hiding it. But it only became the most salient issue in the months before the election, because the Daily Mail just, and it did it enough times that it's not anecdote anymore. So you can get people scared about immigrants at a particular time. But in a world where the majority of the world is well below 2 children, this is going very, very fast down. 17 states in India are below 2. 17 out of 29, I think. It's worrying about people coming, like when we're not having them anymore. It's quite an incredible time to see this occurring. But yes, I'm affected by my biases. The only way I deal with it is by looking at a lot of information, and then in particular highlighting things that surprised me, which, if you like, corrected my original bias. So one tiny example I'll give you. Years ago, me and Beth and Thomas were doing an Atlas of Britain, and we were doing a map of stepchildren and where the most and least stepchildren were. And we found that the least were in Hull and the most were in the Cotswolds. And I just assumed that we'd done a standard error when you're doing this, we got our data the wrong way round. Like, it can't be the Cotswolds full of stepchildren and Hull doesn't have any. But it turned out to be true. People were quite unlikely to get married in Hull. And if you don't get married, you can't get divorced and you can't get stepchildren. And Cotswolds is full of reconstituted families from London who've gone for their first divorce, moved out to the Cotswolds, mum and dad, 4 kids, 2 kids were his, 2 kids were hers. Yeah, and that's really, it's completely changed my view of the Cotswolds. But there's a bias. But yeah, it's only when you have your preconceived ideas flipped that you know it's not your bias. Yeah.
Sorry.
Totally. There's 2 things. One, I made a conscious decision to watch less news when I realised I was seeing dead bodies on the news, and I felt that to be not acceptable on the grounds that the family should know before I'm seeing it on the news 10 seconds probably after it's happened. I cut down news during COVID because all it was COVID. So I pick and choose what I watch, and I found my mental well-being a lot better for it, and I would advise it. But it's also knowing where to find the data. I happen to be, and this is one of my second question, was I was driving yesterday, and I think it was 3 counties, and they were discussing the abortion rates. Not something I've ever looked at. I'm not going to get into morally whether you should or shouldn't. And they were discussing the fact it's been increased heavily in this country. And it's usually where there's more than one child in the family already, and they were implying that the reason for it was financial, not because the child was unwanted. The financial situation the mother was in that position was one of the reasons why, at a high percentage, which I found very concerning. The fact we are dropping birth rate, we're discussing dropping the birth rate. And you can see it in friends and family, and how few people have children, and then to not have the financial well-being that these women are choosing, that seems an awful thing, regardless of why people. I'm not getting into the religious side or anything else. Have you looked at the numbers over the years?
I did a bit in the past. Just say on the news, by the way, there is a decrease in people watching the news in Britain. Which kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
When I looked, which was some years ago, the shock thing was that the highest rate of abortion was in Surrey. And this is why you can't be sure about why, but Surrey at the time, Surrey's got poorer now, obviously, but Surrey at the time was richer. Surrey was the county you were most likely to go to university from. And if you go to university, you're very unlikely to have a child in your early 20s or your late 20s, in your 30s, but you might get pregnant. So you can see that in the statistics. What we're getting now is people are much, much better at not getting pregnant than they were. But yeah, the idea that you can't have a child, you don't have a child because you think you're able to afford it is terrible.
Yeah.
There was one study done. If you remember, there's Michael Gove brought in a thing called the 2-child limit. And there was a very complicated study done by researchers in London. 2-child limit, which you're not going to get child benefit or other benefits if you have a 3rd child, have no effect on stopping people having 3rd. So all it did was make children poorer in large families. But a lot of people say, this is why we're careful, well, I'm glad, it's really hard talking to different audiences about it. A lot of people say they won't have a child because they can't afford one, the cost of housing is so much. And part of that will be true, but if you do have a child, you can't go out much anymore. You know, it actually reduces, the idea that it increases your spending, it reduces it. And there are endless magazine surveys telling you about the cost of bringing up a child, which, and the amusing thing is they almost always include the cost of a private education. 93% of people don't have to worry about that. But yeah, it's... so my guess is that worrying about affording it and staying with a partner on top of everything else that's all the other worries that people have in the world and poor mental health is contributing to not having the children. But it's mainly contraceptive. And there isn't a decrease in the USA in sexual activity at least. Which is partly when we're trying to understand these changes from surveys.
So leave it at the back and then leave it there and then yourself. Yeah, just so you know where you are in the pecking order.
I also read that report in the newspaper yesterday about the people choosing abortions in established families and not for reasons in the past where it would bring shame on the family or something in the 50s. I want to ask about population because for years we were told that it's as possible, there are too many people in the world, etc. So is that now not the case?
Yeah.
Or are you worried about overpopulation or underpopulation? Or is it just a practice of, not having anyone to look after an ageing population? Is it everywhere?
I don't tend to worry. So to me it's fascinating because it's as big. When I was at school we were talking about the Ice Age coming. Right? To get my A-level geography I had to write about it's going to get colder. Because that's what people thought. Even in the curriculum in the 80s. Population, we had the Population Bomb book published in 1968. I thought it was out of control. We had enforced sterilisations in India, one-child policy in China. What almost nobody saw at the time was that it had reached a peak. So it was a ridiculous rate of growth. It's a little bit like there were a few years when life expectancy in Kensington and Chelsea rose by more than a year each year. Right, now you know that's impossible because otherwise, unless people become gods in Kensington and Chelsea. So we go from this tree of too many people. We're still going to go from 8 billion to 10. That move from 8 to 10 is entirely because fewer of us in this room are going to die in the next 10 or 20 years than our parents did. Right? We're going to make it to our 80s, 90s, a few of us to 100. The majority of baby girls at the moment are predicted, I think, to get to almost 100. Right? But that stops. So it's only ageing. Ageing is the only reason the population is going up. But ageing is not carrying on forever. So we are seeing a fall. If we were sensible about it, this is the hard, if the places which are falling the most allowed in people who want to come, and some have, so Finland's second city has reached a new maximum due to immigrants, and they celebrated it, because they're there, then that evens it out a little bit more. And if you work out how to create a situation where people who do want to have 2 or 3 children can have them, then you won't be worried about such a fast fall. It's really fast. A little bit of me is excited about it because it's impossible to record the kind of profits as a company with this falling young population. So most of the last 200 or 300 years, pretend that Coca-Cola had existed for 200 or 300 years. If you're selling Coca-Cola, every year there are more young people to buy your cans. All you've got to do is be as good as last year and you have a bigger profit, you can pay bigger dividends. This collapses with fewer customers. It's not just schools and universities that are in trouble. it's people selling clothes, unless you can persuade people to buy 2 or 3 shirts to wear at the same time. Right? So something very big is happening. I just think we should try a little bit to smooth it out, rather than have this fear of we can't allow people in. And at the current rate, at what point are we going to try and stop people leaving? Which is
worldwide,
yeah.
the global population. We used to be very worried about it increasing, and now we're worried about it.
There's only about 8 or 9 countries left in the world that are projected to have big increases, and I suspect those projections are overestimates.
I'd like to just say on that I've always thought the fact is that often where these families had larger families, they were actually the less harmful to the planet than the rich people who might have only had one and depleted the Earth's resources still at a higher rate. But my point was really going to be about the news and the conspiracy theory one, where it said the UK was fairly low down, and I thought about the BBC and the crises of who has control of the news, and it's talking about what politicians think and what politicians can do. Part of what we, how we look at things is what can be done and what our sources of information.
I've clicked forward to the one I didn't spend time on at all. This is who believe climate change is a hoax. And UK, we're down there at 9% lowest in the world. And that has to be. That's the BBC working in tandem with Sky, and the agreement between the Conservatives and Labour and all the other parties not to argue about this. Now you could call that propaganda because they believe it's a conspiracy. They decided not even to have the debate. But I think it's hard to see that we might be just really, really clever people. But as a country, we're not good at other things necessarily. So just saying we're super clever. We do have a lot of climate change scientists in the UK, but it's 9%, whereas it's Nigeria and the USA. And of course the current US government.
Hi, thanks for your talk. It's more about your earlier work. The index of multiple deprivation came out this year, the next release, and I've been boring over quite a lot of details, and I was interested what you thought it told us about non-poverty in Britain.
So this is the government's official measure of deprivation, which is released, changed every few years. I suspect it's gone up in London. I haven't looked at the latest one, but I suspect it's in London. The most shocking things to do with children, where about 1 in 3 children are officially poor, which means that their families living off half, or about 60% of the median income. The median's quite low. Median household income is probably now about between 25,000 and 30,000 a year, not the mean. So they're living off that. But families with just a tiny bit more money, in a sense, are also poor. What's always been most interesting to me about that data is how segregated we are by it. So you could easily just Google index of multiple deprivation, government map, and have a look, and you'll see here there'll be a tiny few areas somewhere in Milton Keynes that will be coloured red or orange. Not many. Here will be coloured lime green, possibly dark green on the map. The villages that go all the way between here and Oxford, where we drove from this morning, will be largely dark green, very little deprivation. You hit Oxford, which you think of as a rich city, and in the last measure, Oxford had a tenth of its population in each of the deciles of the index of deprivation. So it was ironically the most representative city of England, but only because Oxford's so weird can it be like that, because there's people who are paid very little, who are serving other people, literally sometimes at a high table. And then you have some very well-off London commuters living in Oxford, bane of our lives. So we're really geographically segregated by this, much more than any other country in Europe. And I don't think the index has changed that much. The poverty rate is increasing for children.
I think we've probably got time for one more question. Muriel.
Does the degradation of agricultural soil, should that figure in our list of worries?
Yes. It features in George Monbiot's an environment, you know, how many more harvests have we got, and so on. But it doesn't feature in surveys very highly when you ask people. And so it's tricky to know. It's connected to how much we rely on fertilising the land. But it's not there in the worries. My worry about this is, with 8 billion people on the planet, rising to 10, we are largely dependent on shipping food around the planet. We can't easily, because we've concentrated in cities, it's very, very hard to actually supply the food that people need very, very locally to them. Particularly, and I'm not an expert on this, but I'm a geographer, so allowed, we now have more nutrients. We now eat more nutrients than my parents did or their parents, which is one reason why we're taller on average. But that requires food stuff from coming from around the world. So my concern is the global supply of food and the global degradation of the land and how that's happening. The easiest trite solution to give you is simply eating less meat reduces the amount of farmland that's needed dramatically, because a lot of farmland is used to produce the crops that the animals are eating so that we can eat them. But I don't worry as much as George Monbiot worries about it being our last harvest. There's a lovely book 100 years ago, published 100 years ago, called 100 Generations of Farmers, 100 Generations of Farmers. And it was about sustainable agriculture on the huge plain, I think around the Yangtze River in China, and how 100 years ago people were aware that you could keep the soils the same for some time. Allowing people to make a short-term profit from farming is not going to be good. But I'm out of depth.
Okay, I'm going to ask you the slightly flippant closing question. What's your biggest worry?
What's my biggest worry? It's probably still the one I had when I was 15 and 16. I was 16 in 1984. When they actually set 1984 as a set book for which is ironic. And if you remember down here in 1984, it was Upper Hayford, Queen Common. We were surrounded by nuclear bases. So my biggest worry is still that'll happen. Dr. Strangelove. Yeah, but that's my age. It's my age and where I grew up, my geographical location. It's very hard if as a teenager you thought that nuclear Armageddon was on the cards, not to still have that as a kind of residual worry. But if you're really positive about it, think about how many people work so hard, including inside the military of many countries, actually stop that happening every year. We weren't just lucky. Yeah, there was a lot of good was done to avoid nuclear weapons actually being used in that period. But that remains my biggest worry.
Danny, thank you very much.